So we're continuing as we get started. Thank you all for being on with us tonight. So we're continuing in our series on traits of the greats, discovering and developing the champion leader in you. And I want to take a look at the life of Moses, and in particular in some of the unique nature of how God begins one thing and then ends one thing and begins another. And, Malachi chapter 3, verse 1 says, "And the Lord who you seek will come suddenly to his temple." So there's a sudden element to who God is and what he does. And thinking about on a leadership level, Moses is a classic example of leadership development, and the capacity of God to turn a thing around and to take you from ineffectiveness to influence overnight. Now we're going to read in Exodus 3. We'll kind of be taking our topic from there tonight, Exodus 3 and Acts chapter 7. And so we'll get a little bit into that in a moment. But, the real thing that's important to understand is that God can shift things quickly, and that when God's building you on a leadership level, he doesn't build you to fail, he builds you to succeed. And yet we know that failure is fertile soil. We know it's a part of the development process. Dr. John Maxwell wrote a book entitled Failing Forward. Powerful read. I highly encourage you to have that in your library. But it's important to understand that, and we've been talking about this on Sundays recently, the last couple weeks, that nothing happens outside of the timing of God. And so, the classic verse that we all know so well, Ecclesiastes 3:1, "To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven." And so, Moses has been schooled in the Egyptian model of leadership, the autocratic king dictator model. And now, obviously, Egypt was a highly structured, highly sophisticated culture, highly sophisticated society. And we all know the story of Moses. Moses is basically Pharaoh's adopted grandson because of the deliverance that God gave him, sparing his life by his mother putting him in a basket and putting him in the Nile River. And it just so happened to Moses that when he's an infant, several months old, can't control his outcome. Lo and behold, he is discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. And so because of that, he grows up in Pharaoh's house and is schooled. In fact, Acts chapter 7, when you look at this, I want to just read real quick. It's Acts chapter 7 and then verse 19. And it was he, meaning the Pharaoh, who didn't know Joseph. So there's a loss of favor. Just on seasons change when favor moves. And that's important. Even as a leader, we could talk about seasons of momentum in our churches, our businesses, our organizations. There are times where you feel like you're making progress. And then there are times where you just seem to lose the momentum you had. The Jews had favor through Joseph's influence. And even after Pharaoh died, there's a residual influence. But when favor shifts, seasons change. And seasons change when favor shifts. And as a leader, we have to recognize that. One of the keys to being a kingdom leader is it's critical to know what time we're in. And so as God develops us, as God matures us, we develop a sense as we become reliant and dependent upon the Holy Spirit, as our skill set and our discernment is developed in our faith and on a leadership level. You go through things. There are divine deposits the Holy Spirit gives you. There are gifts and skills that are the charisma of God that are really supernatural, and the impartations that we carry, the gifts we have that come from him and not us. And then in addition to that, there are the skills that we have honed and developed over time. And the process of that, you reach a state in your maturity level as a leader where you can understand timing. And the understanding of timing, by the way, doesn't come because you inherently just know. Even if even if you have a prophetic capacity or prophetic dimension in your life, there are going to be times when you don't know what time you're in. God is a God who hides himself, and even with prophetic people, sometimes God doesn't talk, and sometimes God may talk, but he doesn't tell you what time it is. And so he allows us, when God's building us as leaders, he allows us to fail forward or to go through some strategic failures. And one of the strategic failures that we will go through the most is having to process the fallout of not understanding the timing of God. Because, see, success as a leader is determined by understanding right timing. When is it time to move? When is it time to act? When is it time to take that step of faith? When is it time to risk? And so timing is everything. Timing is everything. And, in all facts or matters of life, but none more so significant than in leadership. And you can have the right idea, but the wrong timing. You can have the right assignment, the wrong timing. So here's the deal. Moses, and listen to this, there's a time that changed. The residual favor is gone. There's no more favor. So they're now in a favor vacuum. And it's in this favor vacuum that Moses is born. And watch this. In Acts chapter 7, it says, verse 19, that there rose up a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph. And so Joseph's influence had waned to the extent that it's no longer in effect. And this Pharaoh begins to identify the purpose and the destiny and potential that the Jews have as a people. In other words, Pharaoh's thinking if they ever get their act together, Egypt is in trouble. So he begins to mistreat them. We all know the story, and this is the backstory and the context into which Moses is born. And so Moses, verse 20, says, it was at this time that Moses was born. Every leader, and when you hear me talk about process, and for those leaders tonight that are in places of process in your life, it's important to remember that you may not be in your leadership function and your leadership effectiveness yet where you feel like you're called to be. In fact, you may feel like you will have a next level calling, a next level mantle. You may be carrying a next level vision, but you're going to have to go through some lower level assignments. And part of growing and developing as a leader is learning how to handle the balance between having next level purpose, next level identity, next level calling, but recognizing that you're in a lower level season. And so Moses doesn't understand that. But the point is that you are born for a time. And there are certain times that God will activate and open up to you on a leadership function in terms of opportunity, effectiveness, or influence, that things begin to click because the timing is right for the flow you carry, for the leadership function or model of what God's called you to do, where he's called you to do it, begins to fit. Everything fits in its time. To everything, there's a time and a season. Ecclesiastes 3:1. So Moses is born in a time for a time. And so he ends up in the house of Pharaoh. Now watch this. And he was nurtured for 3 months in his father's house. And after he'd been set outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and nurtured him as her own. Now watch this. Very, very critical piece of truth on a leadership level. Moses was educated in all of the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds. But when he was approaching the age of 40, now 40 is important because 40 is a number that represents transition. 40 represents transition. It is a time in which something shifts. Something shifts dramatically. Transitions bring us into quantum leaps, where we not only can't go back to the way things were, but that there is a radical departure. Radical transition is about radical transformation, and so there's a departure. that Moses is experiencing when he's 40 years of age. He's entering a time of transition, and it enters into his mind or his heart to visit, to check on his brothers, the Hebrews. So now watch this. There are seasons when God begins to cause the leader in you to identify with people, with dreams, with assignments that you've not previously identified with before. You see, leadership is about the leader shifts that occur in us at specific seasons based on the timing of God, because timing creates movement. Timing creates opportunity. Timing creates movement. So again, please track this, and I really want you to grasp this. Leadership is about leader shifts. Things shift based on the timing of God. I'm going to say it one more time because I really want you to grasp that. And as I say this, and I'm giving this to you as a tool, as a diagnostic tool to help fill out your skill set, so you can identify both some of the things that you're grieving over, the transitions and losses and stuff that maybe you've been through and have experienced on a leadership level, but more importantly, to build courage, hope, and focus in your own understanding to set a parameter of expectation. In fact, a new baseline of expectation for you to begin to forecast the future that now wants to come into view. So watch this. Leadership is all about moments of leader shifts. So Moses identifies now with his Hebrew brothers, even though he's been built culturally and educationally to identify as an Egyptian prince. So when God wants to take us from one level to another in our leadership function, when he wants to institute a fresh season either of leadership development or leadership function, he will bring us to a place where new identities emerge in us. Now, let me qualify what that means. Either you come into a new sense of knowing in yourself, or you begin to discover those leader shifts where you begin to feel a drawing and an attraction and then identify in a way that helps you identify and pay attention to. Things enter your thought life. Things enter your field of vision. Things enter your dream state, the dreamer in you. Things begin to enter into you. They wake up. It's not that they weren't there before. It's that you were not aware of them. So leader shift is about identifying with new levels of understanding, desire, or perception that are awakened in us because of the timing of God. Remember, he makes everything beautiful in his time, and to everything there is a season and a time. There is a time for every purpose under the earth. So your purpose as a leader will have thresholds of leader shifts where certain things will get up in you. Certain things will wake up in you. You'll begin to identify with people you've never identified with before. You'll begin to be drawn to certain levels. It's almost like a subconscious attraction. It is a divine attraction. When God is moving you into a new phase of leadership, he will cause you to begin to be attracted both to where you're headed and to those to whom you're called. God marries attraction with assignment, and leader shifts are places of time in the timing and season in our lives where God brings us to unexpectedly. There are the suddenlies of God. Things in the kingdom shift suddenly, even though God works methodically through process to bring us to thresholds of newness and leader shifts. So tonight, I want to speak to for just a couple of minutes about the leader shifts that we experience, why we experience them, and why they are important. So as long as Moses identifies as an Egyptian, he can never come into the fullness of his calling as a Hebrew prophetic leader. Now see, he knows he's a Hebrew, but he doesn't identify one. And one of the things that's very important is when you look and you see that the book says that Moses was learned in all of the wisdom and the knowledge of the Egyptians. So he's not been trained to think or trained to lead like a Hebrew. He doesn't know kingdom. He's been trained and schooled to think and lead like an Egyptian prince. Now that's important. It's powerful because it says that it brought him to a place of confidence. He's both a man who is a powerful speaker, he's a powerful orator, and he's a powerful doer. He's a man of action. He's a man of intention. He's a man of organization. He's a man of excellence. He's a man who's had proximity to the throne his whole life. And he's had in-depth training and mentoring at the feet of the greatest movers and thinkers and shakers in Egypt. But when God wants to take us to a new place of leadership effectiveness, sometimes God will bring us to moments of leader shifts in what we identify with, where what we used to identify with no longer fits. And I know it no longer fits when it starts not feeling right anymore. Leader shifts are about new dimensions of feeling, thought, awakening, and desire that begin to emerge on the inside of you, in your heart and in your mind, that seem subtle but sudden. And that is the key of God's way of saying, I'm moving you higher up the ladder of leadership development. And so we know what he does. He begins to think. In fact, I'm just going to paraphrase. When he goes out and he sees the Egyptian abusing his Hebrew brother, he identifies now, watch this, he's been trained to think as a leader in Egypt. He's been trained to think, he's been prepared to rule the throne of Egypt. But God said, that's not what I've got for you. I needed you schooled and skilled in certain levels there. Not all of Egypt's training is bad for Moses, but some of it had influenced his thinking, and God needed him in the wilderness to undo that. Because ultimately, we can't succeed in kingdom if we don't, even if you're in a secular marketplace, let's say you're not leading a, quote, kingdom business, but you're a kingdom leader in a secular marketplace. Well, if you're going to succeed and excel, you got to bring the kingdom to that marketplace, and you got to lead and think like a kingdom leader. And so sometimes God walks us through failure for the purposes of helping us to reprogram. We got to unlearn so we can uplearn. That's what leadership is all about. So there's a ton of material here when you really look at it, and there are just moments, there are times, there are seasons of awakening where we no longer feel like we fit where we were. What we used to think, how we used to approach decision making, how we used to handle people, how we used to handle problems, things begin not to feel right anymore. One of the ways you know as a leader that you have reached a time threshold of a leader shift that's going to help empower your leadership function on a greater level is things that used to feel right no longer feel right. Some of the people you used to be able to run with because you kind of thought alike, even some of the leaders, it's not that there's turmoil or division. It's just that your heart and mind are being awakened to identify with things that the folk you used to run with don't identify with. And ultimately, what you identify with is where you're going to head up or end up. And watch this. God will never call you to identify with those he's not called you to lead. Leadership requires authenticity in terms of having influence with those we're called to lead. But if we are in a place where our identity is not right, and we can't clearly state articulately and compellingly so who and what we identify with and who we identify as, then we're going to be schizophrenic in our leadership, and nobody's going to buy into our credibility. That's why Moses has to end up partially for 40 years in the wilderness. It's interesting, and I want to work through this quick. Moses is what, 40? So that's a transition. That's a leader shift. Where does he end up? He kills the Egyptian, and the writer Luke the writer of the book of Acts goes on to say here, if we'd have continued reading, that he thought that the Hebrew brothers, he thought that the people he identified with would identify with him, but they did not. Part of leader shifts that we experience as God is developing us as leaders is that for a time we have to identify with the future God's revealed in us and vision cast that while others still don't yet identify with us. Part of the burden of leadership is being ahead of those who are following your lead. Part of the skill development and our success as a leader is directly understanding timing. So I want to tie this together as we wrap this teaching up tonight. Moses had been trained to what? He'd been trained for military success. He'd been trained for political success. He'd been trained in philosophical discourse. He was an exquisite public speaker. But the one thing that his Egyptian tutors and mentors did not teach him was about the timing of God. And the reason they didn't teach it to him is because they didn't know it. You see, as leaders, we can only give what we possess. I want to say that again. As leaders, we can only give what we possess. And if you've been under mentors and if you've been under leadership that can only give you what they've got, but with what they've got doesn't fit with where you're going, eventually there will be a leader shift so that they don't fit anymore. And there will become something in that dynamic where you may not be able to clearly articulate it, but it doesn't feel right. See, fit always feels right. You put on a suit, ladies put on a dress or a pair of shoes. When it fits right, it feels good. And when it doesn't fit good, it won't feel right. And so leader shifts, and moving from one level of identity to another, it's essential that we recognize those shifts if we are going to increase in our leadership function. We not only have to recognize those leader shift moments where God brings us to thresholds where one thing is over and a new thing is beginning, but we also have to embrace them. God will never provoke you as a leader to identify with a future He's not called you to succeed in. God will never call you to identify with an assignment, whether with a dream, an idea, a people group, or responsibility that He's not already authorized you to have future success with. Now, you may have to go into your Midian, which means strife and contention. And Moses ends up in a wilderness called Midian where he's striving and contending what? For 40 years of the fact of not being able to put together why didn't they get it? What I felt so right. How come it ended up so wrong? Watch this. In certain seasons of leader shifts in our lives, we have to contend and strive with that question when it doesn't get answers. It felt so right, but it turned out so wrong. Why is that important? Because at the end of that 40 years, God's going to show up at a greater leader shift. In Exodus 3 with a burning bush, and there's a revelation that comes to him and says, now you're ready. That the timing that you felt 40 years ago, that you discovered through failure didn't fit. Now I've brought the timing together. I had to let them catch up, Moses, to where you are. And I'm talking to people tonight that have been through the painful process of leadership, of being ahead of some of the people you lead or some of the ideas. Maybe it's not a people thing. Maybe it's an idea thing. Maybe it's a dream thing. And so maybe you've wrestled with, it felt so right. Why didn't it turn out to fit? And it wasn't that your dream or your idea was illegitimate. It was that you had to learn through leader shifts what timing is all about. And so God shows up there, and what does He say? I've come down now to deliver my people. Go, I'm going to send you. So God answers the fit question. But at that level of leadership, Moses isn't feeling the fit. It's completely opposite. See, at the first level of leadership, when God is bringing him, baptizing him, if you will, into development as a kingdom leader, what happens? He feels something that doesn't fit. Now, 40 years later, what is that? That's another transition. Only this time, it's not a transition into darkness. It's a transition out of his preparation. It's a transition into his prepared place. So it's not a downward spiral. It's an upward promotion. But in this leadership, it's completely different. Remember, the first leadership at 40 years old is what? I feel something that doesn't fit. It didn't fit, not in terms of the dream or the idea being, or the calling or what he's feeling being illegitimate. It didn't fit in terms of the timing of God. And as leaders, we're all going to go through that. And when you go through that, one of the things that has to happen is you have to be willing to understand that there will come another leader shift where God wants to release us and free us from those leader shifts at lower levels that took us into transitions or wildernesses or places of darkness or contention. And understand that when you're in that process, that's the greatest progress you're ever going to make in your development as a leader, because your successes will come out of that failure. So God shows up to him and he does what? He spends 40 years schooling him in kingdom leadership, and Moses does not know that's what he's getting, is an education on how to lead people through wilderness. And so at 40 years of age, at 40, he gets the feeling without the fit, but at 80, he gets the fit without the feeling. And it's not until by faith Moses embraces the leader shift God is moving in his life now with. It's not until he by faith receives that this fits. And as he moves in this, what happens is now Moses begins to feel what fits him. And so as I get ready to close this, I want to say this to you, is that for those that have been leading while you're bleeding, so to speak, and you've been leading through the contending and the striving you've been doing and experiencing those leader shifts of identity and awakening and awareness, and maybe you're processing some frustrations, or you're some things right now that just don't seem to feel right with you. And maybe you don't feel good about the stuff you've been through. God's going to bring you to a leader shift, a fresh one, a new one. And he's going to challenge you to believe that he's going to move you into the place of your fit. And if you will flow with that, and if you will embrace that calling and that challenge, one of the things you're going to discover is you're going to recover the old feeling of identity and awakening and awareness that you used to carry. God's going to restore that to you. So he's going to put you where you fit. And in that fit, it's going to feel right. And you are going to feel right again. The greatest, Moses is 80 years of age. And no doubt part of the regret that he processed, part of the frustration and the striving, the contending he was doing with himself must have been on some level, if I had just embraced the Egypt model, there's no telling where I'd be. And when you go down that line of thinking, you begin to believe that your best days are behind you as a leader, especially if at some level you had success and then lost it. God walked you through the fertile soil of failure without talking to you about timing, fit, and flow. And so what Moses doesn't know is that his most effective season of life, he's got a whole nother 40 years, a whole nother third. He's got 1/3 of his life left, and it'll be the best life. That 1/3 will be better than the previous 2/3 put together because of the leader shift that he had to embrace. So, I've left out a lot of material and there's a whole lot to unpack, but the point being tonight is that if God's hands on your life for leadership in whatever sphere, ministry place, marketplace, in the sacred arena or the secular arena, you need to understand that there are times when God will suddenly show up and bring leader shifts. So pay attention to what you're feeling. Be willing to take an honest assessment of what does fit and what doesn't. Here's a key I want to give you. Feelings come and go. Feelings can be fickle. The difference is when God gives you a feeling, what God births in that moment will not die in you. And if you're willing to risk and to dream again, what will happen is God will bring you to that leader shift where fit and feeling come together and you flow in the greatest place of effectiveness as a leader you've ever been through. You know, not only do leaders have, we as leaders, we have enemies, we have opponents, but sometimes the wrestling that we're doing is not with external enemies or circumstances. It's with our own thoughts and feelings and emotions. It's with the own stuff that we have to process and deal with. Moses was no different, and yet, the Jews revered him as the greatest man on the planet throughout the old history. And even to this day, they still revere him as their greatest leader outside of King David. So you've got to understand that there are places of significance that are alive in you now. It's places of significance and significant achievements that God has planned to work through your life. And the leader shifts he walks us through are the keys to bringing us into the full manifestation of that. So I don't know what you're walking through or dealing with, but I pray tonight that the word that we've shared, it's been practical and methodical, but my prayer is that there is wisdom that has been in this moment that will cause a new level of perception to come into your understanding, and also a new capacity for hope, and that the hope of God, as he breathes on your life, will begin to enlarge you from the inside out. And the successes that you have been prepared and called to create will come about as a result of the goodness of God and his faithfulness to you in your places of process, leader shifts, and transition. God's got good things ahead. Your best days are not behind you. Embrace the leader shifts in your life. God's working through them to create an uncommon future. So I thank you for being with us this evening. If you're not already connected and don't know our website, check us out online at citychurchtampa.org. Again, our website is citychurchtampa.org. We have a ton of free content there, and we'd love to connect with you. And if you're not already a Facebook friend or follower, check us out on Facebook at Pastor Howard Bass. I'd love to connect with you there as well. Thank you so much for being part of our iChurch sessions on Wednesday evening. And thanks for putting up with a little bit of technical challenges we had at the beginning. That's why we've run over a little bit tonight. I pray that this material is a strategic supplement and adding to your skill set as a leader. And I know God's got great things